When historians gather to name the worst monarch in Spain's long and turbulent history, one name consistently rises above the rest. Not for failed policies alone, not for lost battles or treaties, but for something far darker. Ferdinand VII was not merely a bad king, he was a predator in royal robes, a man whose deformity and obsession would leave scars on both his wives and his kingdom. The story does not begin in the throne room or on the battlefield, but in the most private chamber of all, the royal bedchamber, because what Ferdinand carried beneath his robes was no ordinary burden of royalty. He suffered from a grotesque anatomical condition, one that even modern medicine struggles to classify neatly. Eyewitnesses, from physicians to foreign diplomats, all described the same horrifying reality. Ferdinand's genitals were monstrously oversized, not in a way that inspired awe, but in a form so misshapen it became an instrument of terror. Thin at the base, swollen and grotesque at the end, longer than any human anatomy should allow, it was less the organ of a man than the weapon of a nightmare. This deformity shaped his destiny. It humiliated him, corrupted him, and in the end, defined his reign. To understand how Spain's throne descended into such scandal, we need to return to the early years of Ferdinand's married life. At just 17, Ferdinand wed his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. A marriage meant to secure alliances became instead a theatre of humiliation. For 11 months, the marriage remained unconsummated. Maria Antonia wrote despairing letters home, confessing that her husband would gawp at her like a child, fondle her clumsily, and then withdraw in confusion. He quite literally did not know how to complete the act. His anatomy was so abnormal, so unwieldy, that intercourse became a puzzle he could not solve. The shame of this failure seeped into the gossip channels of Europe's courts. The Spanish heir, mocked behind closed doors, was whispered to be less than a man. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina, wrote bitterly that the prince feels nothing. There is no pleasure, no effect. Eventually, the humiliation grew so unbearable that the royal confessor was brought in. Imagine, a Catholic priest, tasked with teaching a future king of Spain how to have sex with his own wife. When Ferdinand finally managed to complete the act after nearly a year, the result was disaster. Maria Antonia miscarried twice, her body broken by her husband's deformity. She died at just 21, exhausted, injured, and alone. Her death was whispered about in European salons not as tragedy, but as scandal. Spain's prince was a grotesque figure, part man, part monster. But Ferdinand was not finished with marriage. If his first union ended in humiliation, his second would begin in horror, October 1819. The royal palace of Madrid. 16-year-old Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, a girl raised in a convent, sat trembling in her bridal chamber. She had been sheltered to the point of absurdity, taught by her attendants that babies came from storks. Now, dressed in white, clutching a rosary in her hands, she waited for a husband twice her age to enter her chamber. She had been told nothing about what awaited her on this night. When Ferdinand entered, it was no fairy tale prince who greeted her. 35 years old, overweight, his body swollen with gout, his lips thick and pendulous, he carried himself with the eyes of a predator. But it was not his face or his temper that froze Maria Josefa in terror. It was what lay beneath his nightshirt. French writer Prosper Mérimée recorded courtiers' descriptions in grotesque detail. The king revealed himself, and the young bride screamed in terror. She fled the bed, running around the chamber, while Ferdinand, drunk and clumsy, stumbled after her. Imagine the scene. A powerful king, naked, furious, and grotesquely deformed, chasing a 16-year-old girl who barely understood what marriage even meant. When he failed to catch her, his humiliation boiled over. Ferdinand burst from the chamber naked, his deformity on display, and shouted at the Queen's attendants. He demanded they prepare her within 15 minutes for his return. The attendants, women, powerless and horrified, were forced to explain to the trembling child what her husband intended. Whatever they said only deepened her terror. When Ferdinand returned, ready to enforce his marital rights, he found the room soiled. Maria Josefa, overwhelmed with fear, had lost control of her bowels. The royal wedding bed, meant to seal an alliance, was fouled with human waste. Ferdinand recoiled, insulted beyond bearing. "Queens do not possess the fragrance of civet," he spat before storming out. He refused to touch his new bride for a week, but the horror of that wedding night was only the beginning of Maria Josepha's nightmare. Behind the palace walls, whispers spread. Some claimed God himself had cursed Spain with a king whose body was as corrupted as his soul. Others said his deformity was symbolic, a physical manifestation of a monarchy already rotting from within. For Maria Josepha, however, it was not symbolism, it was reality. She was trapped in a marriage with a man whose very body was a weapon, and whose pride demanded that he use it, no matter the cost. Thus began a story unlike any other in European royalty. A story where power, sex, humiliation and violence collided, reshaping not only the lives of queens but the destiny of Spain itself. The wedding night fiasco did not cure Ferdinand of his obsession. If anything, humiliation only sharpened his cruelty. For weeks he alternated between ignoring Maria Josepha and attempting to educate her in the most degrading ways. Court officials recorded a pattern that bordered on ritual. Ferdinand would drink heavily, summon his teenage bride, and attempt intercourse, only to be met with tears, terror, or physical injury. Maria Josepha wrote desperate letters to her family, begging to return to Saxony. None were answered. She was a queen, now Spain's pawn in dynastic politics, and her suffering was of no concern to those who had arranged her marriage. Ferdinand, meanwhile, became increasingly obsessed with proving his masculinity. For a man mocked throughout Europe as a grotesque failure, sexual domination was his only refuge. He began keeping meticulous notes of his attempts to bed his wife, recording dates, times, even physical descriptions of her reactions, as if documenting livestock breeding rather than human intimacy. The young queen's terror soon spread through the palace. Servants whispered about screams echoing from her chamber. Priests who attended her reported that she fainted at the mere mention of conjugal duties. The marriage bed became a battlefield, soaked not in blood but in shame and fear. Yet Ferdinand took pride in this domination. To him, Maria Josepha's sobbing and trembling were not signs of trauma, but proof of his virility. He would boast to his ministers that his wife resisted him only because she was inexperienced, and that his persistence was evidence of masculine vigour. But outside the bedchamber, Spain itself was falling apart. It was the year 1820. Across Europe, revolutions and liberal movements shook the old order. In Spain, soldiers rose up in rebellion, demanding a constitution and an end to absolute monarchy. Ferdinand, whose obsession with his wife consumed his nights, faced the greatest crisis of his reign during the day. Here lay the tragic paradox. While Spain's streets filled with chants for liberty, while colonies in the Americas broke away one by one, the King of Spain was more concerned with his bedroom humiliations than with his collapsing empire. Maria Josepha became the silent witness to this decay. Confined, terrified, and physically weakened, she was paraded in public as the pure, dutiful queen. But behind closed doors, her life was defined by forced couplings and psychological torment. One night, according to memoirs of palace attendants, the king attempted a grotesque experiment. Furious at his inability to produce an heir, he forced physicians to examine his wife, demanding to know whether her coldness was the cause of his failure. The doctors, horrified, concluded that it was Ferdinand's own deformity that rendered conception almost impossible. But no one dared tell him the truth directly. Instead, they reassured him with evasions, fearful of his wrath. As months turned into years, Maria Josepha's health declined. She grew pale, frail, almost ghost-like. Court painters who captured her image softened her features, disguising the misery that had hollowed her eyes. But among the palace staff she was known as the Weeping Queen. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's cruelty spread beyond the bedroom. He took revenge on his people with the same sadism he inflicted on his wife. He abolished the liberal constitution, reinstated the Inquisition's shadow, and filled prisons with those who dared oppose him. To the Spanish people he became El Deseado, the desired one, said first in hope, then in bitter mockery. Still, the king obsessed over an heir. Spain needed one, and Ferdinand's legitimacy depended on producing a child. Maria Josepha bore the weight of that expectation like a cross. Night after night, She endured his advances, praying only for the torment to end, yet no child came. Finally, in 1829, after 10 years of suffering, Maria Josepha died at just 25 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis. But in whispers, courtiers suggested another truth, that she had been broken not by disease, but by the nightly assaults of her monstrous husband. For Ferdinand, her death was not tragedy, it was inconvenience. The throne still lacked an heir, and so, astonishingly, within months, he prepared to marry again. But this time, it would not be a girl from Saxony or Naples. No, this time the king would reach for a bride closer to home. A niece, barely 16, would be chosen as his third queen. If the first two marriages had ended in humiliation and despair, the third would set Spain itself on a path toward chaos that would echo long after Ferdinand's death. By the late 1822, Ferdinand VII was a widower twice over, but his obsession with producing an heir had not faded. Spain's throne remained fragile, threatened by liberal uprisings at home and independence wars in the Americas abroad. Without a legitimate son or daughter, the Bourbon dynasty itself risked collapse. And so, in a move that shocked even his own courtiers, Ferdinand decided to marry again. His choice? Not a foreign princess this time, but someone far closer to home, his own niece, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily. Maria Cristina was only 16 when the marriage was arranged. She had been raised in a conservative Catholic court, taught to obey, to pray, and to sacrifice. For her, becoming Queen of Spain should have been an honour. Instead, it meant stepping directly into the nightmare that had already consumed two young brides before her. The wedding in December 1829 was a glittering spectacle, filled with fireworks, music, and parades meant to distract the people from the truth. Their king was 55 years old. Diseased with gout, swollen with years of gluttony and debauchery, and infamous for his monstrous deformity, Maria Cristina, by contrast, was fresh-faced, educated, and intelligent. But above all, she was ambitious. Unlike Maria Josepha before her, Cristina was determined not to become another weeping queen. If she had to share her life with a man who terrified her, then she would at least wield the crown that came with it. On their wedding night, the pattern repeated. Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy, his drunken impatience, and his violent insistence left her shocked and horrified. But unlike her predecessors, Maria Cristina did not collapse into helplessness. She endured, calculating. She understood that her only weapon was survival and, if possible, giving Spain the heir it so desperately needed. To the astonishment of the court, she succeeded. In 1830, Maria Cristina became pregnant. When she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, Ferdinand's pride swelled. For the first time in decades, the question of succession seemed resolved. But a new problem arose: Spain's laws. The Salic law, inherited from France, barred women from inheriting the throne. If Ferdinand died without a son, the crown would pass not to Isabella, but to his brother, Don Carlos, a reactionary absolutist beloved by Spain's conservatives. This was the spark that would ignite one of Spain's bloodiest civil conflicts. Determined to secure Isabella's future, Ferdinand issued the pragmatic sanction of 1830, overturning the Salic law and naming his daughter heir. It was a bold, unprecedented move, one that divided Spain into two camps. The Carlists, loyal to Don Carlos, furious at the idea of a female monarch. The Isabelinos, loyal to the king's young daughter and her mother, Maria Cristina. Ferdinand, however, remained more obsessed with his body than with politics. His gout grew worse, his flesh swelled, and his face became bloated and purple with disease. By 1832, he was so ill that he could barely walk. Some thought he would not survive the year. Sensing opportunity, Don Carlos's supporters moved quickly. Priests, generals, and ministers swarmed the dying king's bedside, pressuring him to revoke the pragmatic sanction and restore his brother's claim. For a moment, it seemed they had won Ferdinand's signed document stripping his daughter of the throne. But Maria Cristina was no passive queen. She fought back fiercely. Gathering loyal ministers and using her influence over her husband, she pressured him to reverse the decision. Eyewitnesses describe a dramatic scene. the king, bloated and bedridden, struggling to breathe, while his ambitious young wife placed papers in front of him and demanded his signature. In the end, Ferdinand relented. Isabella remained the heir, and when Ferdinand finally died in 1833, Spain erupted into chaos. The country split in two. Don Carlos declared himself rightful king, sparking the First Carlist War. Maria Cristina, now regent for her 3-year-old daughter, took control of Spain's government, navigating between liberals, conservatives, and generals in a desperate bid to preserve her daughter's crown. For Spain, Ferdinand's death was both a relief and a curse. The predator king was gone, but the scars he left on his wives, his people, and his kingdom would not heal easily. His deformity, his obsessions, and his cruelty had not only destroyed the women closest to him, but had plunged the nation into civil war. It was a legacy of humiliation and blood. And yet, in one final irony, Ferdinand himself seemed oblivious to the chaos he left behind. In his last days, bedridden and nearly blind, he muttered only about his pain, his swollen flesh, and his inability to eat without agony. Spain burned, dynasties shattered, and the king who had caused it all died as he had lived, selfish, grotesque, and utterly blind to the suffering around him. Ferdinand VII died in September 1833, leaving behind a throne occupied not by a son, but by his 3-year-old daughter Isabella II. And with that single fact, Spain was plunged into one of the most violent chapters of its history. For centuries, monarchs had left behind fragile heirs, but never before had Spain's crisis of succession been so directly tied to the deformity and obsessions of one man. Ferdinand's inability to produce a healthy son, his grotesque legacy of broken queens and miscarriages, was now a political fault line that threatened to tear the nation in half. At the centre stood two figures: Isabella II, the toddler queen, whose crown rested precariously on her tiny head; Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, who declared himself rightful king under the old Salic law. The stage was set for civil war. The Carlist cause. The supporters of Don Carlos became known as Carlists. They were traditionalists, ultra-conservative nobles, rural peasants, and fanatical clergy, who believed monarchy was sacred and unchangeable. To them, a woman on the throne was an abomination. More than that, Isabella's succession was a betrayal of divine order, engineered by an ambitious young queen mother and corrupt ministers. Carlists rallied to the cry of God, King, and Fatherland. In villages, priests thundered from pulpits, declaring Isabella illegitimate, and calling on peasants to rise with muskets and farm tools in defence of Don Carlos. The Isabellinos. Opposing them were the Isabellinos, loyal to Isabella II and her regent, Maria Cristina. They were liberals, urban elites, merchants, and reformists who saw in Isabella's fragile crown a chance to modernise Spain. Supporting a child queen was risky, but it offered an opportunity, a regency government that could steer Spain toward constitutional monarchy and away from absolutism. War in the Hills. From 1833 to 1840, Spain descended into the First Carlist War. It was not a war of grand battles alone, but of brutal guerrilla campaigns, ambushes and reprisals. In the Basque Country and Catalonia, Carlist bands haunted the hills, striking Isabellino convoys and then vanishing into the forests. The cruelty was legendary. Villages suspected of harbouring Carlists were burned to the ground. Families loyal to Isabella were executed without trial. Carlist fighters in turn massacred prisoners, branding them traitors to God. Foreign powers watched closely. Britain and France, fearing Spain might collapse entirely, sent troops and money to aid Maria Cristina. Across the Pyrenees, exiled liberals saw Spain's struggle as part of a wider European battle against reactionary monarchies. Maria Cristina's gamble. At the heart of this storm was Maria Cristina, now regent. For all her youth and inexperience, she proved far more capable than her monstrous husband ever had. She played factions against one another, courted foreign support, and held the government together, but she was also pragmatic and deeply controversial. To secure loyalty, she granted reforms she personally disliked, including limited constitutional concessions. Each step alienated someone, Conservatives accused her of betraying the monarchy, while liberals claimed she moved too slowly. Worse, she carried her own scandal. In secret, Maria Cristina began an affair with a royal guard, Agustín Muñoz, a man far below her station. To the Spanish people, the revelation that their queen regent had taken a common soldier as lover was both shocking and strangely symbolic. Where Ferdinand had terrorized his wives, Maria Cristina chose desire freely, defying dynastic expectation. When their secret marriage eventually became known, the court was scandalized. But Maria Cristina, unlike her predecessors, refused to be broken by gossip. She wielded her position with iron will, determined that her daughter would reign. A kingdom forever changed. By 1839, exhausted by years of violence, both sides sought peace. The Convention of Vergara ended the First Carlist War, though pockets of resistance would flare for decades. Isabella II remained queen, her mother still regent. Don Carlos fled into exile, but Carlist movements endured, simmering beneath Spain's surface like embers waiting for wind. All of this, the bloodshed, the shattered villages, the political instability, can be traced back to Ferdinand's bedroom. His inability to father a son, his obsession with domination, his monstrous anatomy and cruelty toward his wives. These private horrors spilled outward, shaping the destiny of an entire nation. Historians sometimes call Ferdinand VII the worst king Spain ever had, yet that description feels almost too light. His reign was not only disastrous in governance but catastrophic in intimacy. From the screams of a teenage bride on her wedding night to the screams of peasants massacred in the hills of Navarre, Ferdinand's legacy was one of pain. Spain had survived him, but barely. And the little girl he left behind, Isabella II, would inherit not just his crown, but the enemies, scandals and curses he had sown. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his daughter Isabella II was only 3 years old. She would never remember her father, but she inherited the wreckage he left behind, a fractured nation, a bloody civil war, and a monarchy rotting from within. Maria Cristina, her mother, served as regent through the 1,830 seconds. She fought tirelessly to defend Isabella's crown, but every decision was a compromise. To hold Spain together, she alternated between appeasing liberals and conservatives, between granting reforms and rolling them back. The result was instability, mistrust, and rebellion. Meanwhile, the Carlists did not disappear. Though Don Carlos fled into exile, his followers remained fanatical. In sermons and pamphlets, they claimed Isabella was illegitimate, the product of a fraudulent decree, and that Ferdinand's true heir was his brother. For decades, Carlist pretenders would rise again and again, sparking further wars. Spain would bleed repeatedly in the 19th century because of a king whose obsession with domination had denied the country a stable succession. Isabella II's struggle. As Isabella grew, the burden of her crown weighed heavily. At 13, she was declared of age and thrust into rule. But she was no ordinary monarch. She was a child raised in the poisonous atmosphere of court intrigue, scandal, and whispered hatred of her father's memory. Her reign was marked by turbulence. Coups, uprisings, and ministerial crises followed one after another. Spain oscillated between absolutism and liberalism, never finding stability. Isabella herself became controversial. Like her mother, she scandalized the court with rumored affairs. Like her father, she struggled with legitimacy, never quite commanding the love of her people. The shadow of Ferdinand. But behind all of this loomed Ferdinand VII. Even after his death, his name was invoked like a curse. Liberals denounced him as the tyrant who had strangled Spain's hopes of reform. Conservatives, though they defended monarchy, winced at the memory of his grotesque private life. Foreign observers mocked him as the symbol of Spain's decay, a king more monstrous than man. In private letters, ambassadors still repeated the stories: the oversized deformed organ, the sobbing teenage queens, the soiled wedding bed. These tales, whispered in palaces across Europe, became part of his legend. Few monarchs in history are remembered so vividly, not for the grandeur of their reign, but for the horrors of their bedroom. A kingdom's curse. The irony is cruel. Ferdinand had lived his entire life desperate to prove his manhood, to silence the whispers of impotence, to dominate the women forced into his bed. And yet, history remembers him not as a virile monarch, but as a grotesque failure, his body a symbol of a monarchy already rotten, his legacy one of humiliation and blood. Spain endured him, survived him, but was never the same. The Carlist Wars scarred generations. The throne he left his daughter was unstable, contested, and eventually lost. Isabella II would herself be overthrown in 1868, exiled like so many Bourbon monarchs before her. And Ferdinand? His name remains a warning. The worst king of Spain, perhaps one of the worst in Europe, whose deformity was not just physical but moral. A man who destroyed his wives, poisoned his dynasty, and left his kingdom to drown in blood, all because he could not control the monster he carried, both in his body and in his soul. Epilogue. In history, kings are often remembered for their crowns, their battles, their palaces. Ferdinand VII is remembered for his deformity, his cruelty, and the screams that echoed from his bedchamber. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters of history do not lurk in battlefields or dungeons. Sometimes they wear crowns.